My name is Cassia, Laham.
My name is Bernadette Ellerin.
Right, so we will be co-chairing this panel. It's somewhat appropriate that we started this morning, talking about domestic issues, right, and how U.S. imperialism affects us here at home. And we're going to be talking about Palestine, we're going to be talking about countries in Europe, and how to defeat U.S. imperialism and colonial Zionism in this panel. It's important that we sort of draw these connections, though, right? We talk about how the black community is affected by U.S. imperialism. Well, what does that mean? Well, in a lot of ways, right, if you look at Palestine, the same weapons, right, and the same police tactics that are being used to oppress the people of Palestine were being used to oppress the people of Ferguson and Baltimore, right? The same government calling for deportations of immigrants is wrecking the countries like Honduras and Haiti and Yemen, right? The same sexist, misogynistic system at home is creating widows and orphans, right, in countries across the globe, right? So these things are not just domestic and they are not just abroad, right? The wars always come home and our issues at home always get manifested abroad. So we're going to keep that in mind as we move on to the international section of our panel today. So our first panelist is Adeeb Abed, and he is a longtime Palestinian activist, founder and president of the Arab American Association of Central Virginia.
Thank you very much. And I chose the short introduction, so maybe I can take 30 seconds extra at the end of my 8 minutes. The topic today is 69 years of from the Nakba, and the Nakba, which is the catastrophe the Palestinians refer to, and 50 years of occupation, 1967 till today, and where do we go from here? I'm not going to go into a long history of the conflict because it's all known, but there is few points that needs to be highlighted in order for us to know where to go from here. And that's that Palestinian refugees were pretty much refugees before the 1948 war. The Palestinian refugees, 700,000 of which were displaced prior to Israel declaring their independence and the Arab armies saying, we are not going to accept it, and the launching a war against the state of Israel. And these Palestinians are dispersed in neighboring countries in refugee camps. And I believe it's the longest refugee camps in existence are those of Palestinians. For 69 years, we have them in Lebanon, in Jordan, in the West Bank, and there is even refugee camps in Gaza. But having said that, the conditions of the Palestinians in the refugee camps is one thing. The conditions of the Palestinians in the West Bank is another. And the conditions of the Palestinians inside 1948 Israel. And in the last several years, I've been traveling quite frequently to the West Bank and Palestinian territories and to Israel on a yearly basis. I would like to kind of just go into what is the situation right now, today, as it exists for the Palestinian people. And we start with the 1948. You go to the 1948 territories, you cross a checkpoint and you enter into Israel proper. You drive on highways that are every bit as nice, probably nicer than the US highways that we have here. Highway 6 from Jerusalem to Acre, and it's super highway with the latest, it's 8 lanes, I believe it was. And they have the Easy Pass system where it scans your car without slowing down and sends you the bill for traveling on that toll road. And you go into towns, you could tell you are in an Israeli Jewish town because of the infrastructure there. First thing you will notice is that you will not see any water tanks on the buildings. Another thing, you will see traffic lights, roads that are very modern, no potholes, paved roads, organized communities, subdivisions, shopping malls, all of it. Then you drive and you make a turn, and you turn into a Palestinian village or a Palestinian town or a Palestinian part of a city from 1948. And you get transformed from 2017 back to 1948. That same narrow roads, still there. Some of them are still unpaved. There is no infrastructure. The schools get minuscule amounts of money for the Palestinian towns. And you can't help but say, wow, but I thought these people are in Israel and they have Israeli citizenship. And they vote and they have members of the Knesset. But the discrimination is so blatant and so obvious. And in the end, I will say why I'm talking about this. And also, it's not just an infrastructure. Palestinians are not even protected from common, everyday criminal activity. Take the town of Kfar Qasim in the last 2 years. Palestinian towns are gang infested because of lack of education, because of poverty, there's drugs, and there is murders. The town of Kfar Qasim had no less than 15 murders in the last 2 years. And every time the Israeli police gets called, they come, they investigate. Not one was resolved. Not one. Not one perpetrator was caught. And that is in most of the Palestinian cities and towns, because it's by design, not to catch the perpetrators, because it's Arab against Arab violence, who cares? Let them kill each other. Then we go to the rest of the Palestinians from 1948, from the Nakba. Some of them went to camps in the West Bank. And after 1967, some of these Palestinians got displaced again, are in Jordan, in camps. Some in Lebanon. But I just want to mention one particular camp so we'll know what kind of life they're leading. And that's the camp of Ain al-Hilwa in Lebanon. The camp of Ain al-Hilwa is surrounded from all sides and enclosed with walls and barbed wires, and there is a gate, an entrance. And everything that gets into the camp is checked at the gate. Checked for what? For building material. Because it's not allowed. You can't repair a structure in Ain al-Hilwa until today. Palestinians in Lebanon, by law, there is 67 professions that are off limits. You can't practice as a doctor, you can't practice, even garbage collectors, by the way, are not off limits to Palestinians. You can't work on a garbage truck. Palestinians in Syria, 1 minute remaining, I haven't started. Anyway, where do we go from here in 1 minute? Where we go from here is in Palestine right now we have 5.5 million Palestinian Arabs and 5.5 million Jews. The idea of the two-state solution was viable back in 1970, when there is the idea of land swap for peace. But in 2017, it's an impossibility. With all the settlements, and they are not settlements, they are sprawling cities, colonizing their colonies. There's 600,000 Jewish settlers in these settlements that are separated by Jewish-only roads. The wall that is snaking all around enclaves on the Palestinian territory, to where every 5 or 6, I see that I'm taking my 30 seconds. Every 5 or 6 villages are surrounded by a small wall. So it is absolutely intolerable, and Oslo Accord was the end of the possibility and the feasibility of the two-state solution, not the beginning. Because of that implementation of the Oslo Accords and what Israel is doing since the Oslo Accords, it made it impossible. The only solution left is a one-state solution, which is exactly what we have. Israel always, in all of their agreements, states that the security from the river to the sea belongs to Israel. So that's a one state. Even Oslo agrees to that. The Palestinian Authority agrees to that. It's one state, but one state, what kind of state? A state with equal rights to everyone, Palestinians, Ethiopian Jew, and the Ashkenazi European Jew have the same rights. And other than that, if we continue to talk about two states, we're going to end up with one state, that's what the Netanyahu and his Zionist cohorts are planning for, and that one state will be with a new and improved apartheid system, and they will declare it when they feel the time is right for them. They will tell Abbas and his cronies, pack their bags and go, and it's one state, you render to fourth-class citizens, and there you go. So to support the Palestinian people, you must support the Palestinian people on the basis of basic human rights. They deserve no less than the Ashkenazi Jew. Don't compare the Palestinian with other Arab countries. Compare me with the Israeli Jew. It is really unfair to say the Palestinian Arabs in Israel are faring better than the Arabs in other Arab countries. I don't care. But I'm not faring as good as the Jew in Palestine. That's who I need to be compared with. And I thank you very much, and I appreciate your time. I will be around. I'm not leaving if you have any questions.
Thank you, Adeeb. Our next speaker is Matyas Benyik. Matyas Benyik is an economist and social scientist who has worked as a Foreign Service commercial attaché in Turkey and Syria. Chairman of the Attack Hungary Association, he works for democratic control of financial markets and institutions. He has campaigned against GATS and WTO and on anti-war, anti-fascist, and anti-poverty issues. Matyas Benyik.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon to everybody. I am very much happy to be here with you, and I want to thank again the organizers to invite me here. So what I'm going to talk about is the balance sheet of the transformation in Hungary and put it into a wider perspective, how it happened. I prepared a paper which is 10 pages long, so I can't and don't want to read it out. So I made some remarks, so maybe my presentation will be some thesis. So maybe later on we can talk about, and if you have any questions, I am free to and happy to answer that. So the systemic change, what happened not only in Hungary but in the region, in the previous socialist countries, has reasons. Why did it happen? I found 4 points here why it happened. First of all, there was an economic and political crisis, in the plural, at the end of the 70s. Started with the oil crisis, started with the inability of Soviet Union to keep the arms race to help, the socialist countries, because the Soviet Union was our main source for minerals, iron ore, gas and oil, and still it is regarding the energy side. So there was an oil crisis at the end of the 70s and started a big problem between the trade relations with the Soviet Union, the socialist countries, especially Hungary. And because the terms of trade changed dramatically because of high oil prices, more products had to be exported against the energy. So this created a crisis in Hungary, but not only in Hungary. So I think this was one of the elements why the systemic change came. The other thing was this globalization process. We started at the 70s, the so-called Washington Consensus. So this has been, tried out first in Chile, and then came the socialist countries, of course, the weak socialist countries like Hungary, which is a weak, small country. So the globalization process started, and more influence from the West, from the Western propaganda, came to Hungary. After this started, a kind of, how would I say, melting down of the socialist system from outside. And of course, because of the economic difficulties, some political difficulties started as well. The one-party system, which in Hungary was one party called the Hungarian Socialist Party, started to be also divided. There were debates in the parties. There were internal fights. So this led at the end of the 80s to the disperse or to the division of the party. We had 800,000 party members, comparing to the 10 million population, which was very big number. And immediately after this change, at the end of the 80s, when the Hungarian Socialist Party had the Congress, it became, let's say, the 10% of the 800,000, remained in the party. Party members left, and it seemed that the whole machinery in the party was also, one of the current was following the neoliberal agenda, and started to say that Hungary is not competitive, and we need to open up the market. We need to join the international financial institution and so on. So I have to mention here another reason, which partly I was talking about. That was the role of the American ambassador at that time, Mark Palmer, who helped the opposition. I mean, those who wanted to bring down the socialist system. So Palmer helped very much those liberals in Hungary and inside the party as well, who helped to bring down socialism in Hungary. So very briefly, this I found very important in the systemic change in Hungary, which happened, of course, as you know, at the end of the 80s. So the consequence, I would like to talk about the consequences. What happened after 89, 90? Of course, there was a privatization. That was the first thing to do, to privatize all state properties, sell out, as quickly as possible at the lowest price possible. So that was the first systemic change in our country. In the wake of the privatization, unemployment went up to 1.5 million, which is a very huge number if you take into account that the total active population in Hungary was about 5 million. So immediately 1.5 million lost their jobs. And very few of them could come back again to the labor market. So the effect of this privatization and the systemic change was very dramatic for the employment of the people. The working class became very much dispersed and atomized. Because the main place for organization of the working class was the big factories, where thousands of people worked together. The other thing was that the poverty rate increased dramatically. In the socialist system, we had poor people, but not as seriously or extremely poor than after this change. The poverty rate by the middle of 2005, 2006, it became 40%, which is very, very, very high percentage. Of course, the official statistics show only about 17% comparing to the European Union Eurostatic. But in reality, this is the number. And of course, the social degradation, which was previously free of charge, then it became immediately a payable thing. Of course, it was education, one of the things, the higher education, which was previously free of charge, became payable only a certain quota. Yeah, so I have to wrap up. Okay, so many things became payable, and degradation went on in the field of education, healthcare, and of course previous social benefits and things became unpayable for many of us. So briefly, because my time is over, I have to close my speech. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Matyas. Next up is Joe Lombardo. Joe is a UNAC co-coordinator and delegate to the Troy Area Labor Council, a lifelong anti-war and social justice activist. He is a former staff person for the Vietnam-era National Peace Action Coalition, member of the Bethlehem Neighbors for Peace, and recently represented UNAC at the anti-NATO march and rally in Brussels.
Hello. Well, the first time I got involved in protesting NATO was when they came to the United States in 2012. NATO and the G8 were going to come together for a week-long conference. Each was going to have a week-long conference in Chicago. And this, of course, was under President Obama, and this was President Obama's town, Chicago, and I think he had visions of these world leaders showing off his great town and going out and having cocktails or whatever these people do. But we put a crimp in his style. We decided to organize against the G8 and against NATO. And I don't think he thought that we would have such a big protest. UNAC was the primary organizer of those protests. What happened was, as it became clearer and clearer that buses were coming and people were going to build towards a big rally, and we were going to have activity leading up to the rally and so forth, we had an alternative summit to the NATO summit that was coming on. They started understanding that they were going to see some opposition, serious opposition in Chicago. And so the first thing they did was decided, well, maybe we shouldn't have both NATO and the G8. and they moved the G8 to Camp David. And Camp David is one of these places where you can't get within a mile of it. So this guaranteed that nobody was going to really be there for the G8 protest, but they still were going to have the NATO protest there. And we kept on building. Then they thought, well, maybe a week-long NATO summit is too long. Maybe we should cut it down to 2 days. And so they cut it down to 2 days. And this was a big victory for our movement. NATO was coming to town. People didn't think NATO was a big thing in the United States. It was bigger in Europe, and that we wouldn't protest it. But we were able to bring 15,000 people out on the streets, and we have had the largest anti-NATO protest that has happened in the world as of today. That protest was led by Iraq and Afghan veterans, and a contingent of them, large contingent of them, marched, and at the end of the rally, they had a stage set up, and one after the other, the stage was as close as we could get to the NATO summit. They said they threw their medals that they had won from their war in the direction of NATO and promised to never fight another rich man's war. So while we were there were people from Europe that were there also. There was the No to War and No to NATO organization. There was the World Peace Council, and I think they were surprised that we were able to put on such a large action and have an alternative summit that brought 800 people together, which was very good. So we've kept in touch. And we've been to all the different NATO protests ever since. The one before this was actually in Poland, which was very interesting and was very hard to organize there. And Phil Wilayto at the end there represented UNAC at that one. So this one, they called me up and said, will you come and speak? And there was actually 2 alternative summits. I was able to speak at both. After the first alternative summit, which was with the World Peace Council, we marched to the demonstration that took place there, and they had a large demonstration in downtown Brussels. The demonstration was great. There were delegations from different countries. There were about 12,000 people that were there. And I remember the Germans, some of the Germans dressed up in these nice jackets and things. And since Trump was coming there too, and Trump was demanding that all the countries raise their military budgets and so forth for NATO, they were mimicking his thing of "Make America Great Again." So they were carrying signs saying, "Make Germany Great Again." But you know, you think about that in terms of the city that we're in today. In Germany, you could not have a statue of Hitler. You could not have swastikas. It is illegal. In their schools, they teach what happened during World War II and how terrible it was and the Holocaust that took place so that it will never be repeated again. But you know, slavery ended 150 years ago. And we have Confederate statues here and in cities all throughout the South. About the same number of people died in the middle crossing from Africa to here as died in the Holocaust. It was a Holocaust. It continues to be a Holocaust. The racism continues right to today, and it's shown by those statues, which should be an affront to every single human being in this country, and they must be brought down. But that's the state that we live in. Well, the next day there was the second conference, anti-NATO conference, and I was asked to speak on the expansion of NATO. You know, when NATO was founded, there was, after World War II, there was 12 countries in it. There were 10 from Europe and Canada and the United States. It was formed to try to stop the influence of the Soviet Union. 8 years later, the Soviet Union, to counter NATO, made the Warsaw Pact nations, which was the Soviet Union and its allies in Eastern Europe, to try to make a buffer. But when the Soviet Union collapsed and the Warsaw nations collapsed, the Warsaw Pact stopped. But NATO didn't stop. But the reason for NATO is no longer there. Not only did NATO not stop, it grew. And it has grown today to 28 countries. There are 28 countries. At the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union, we had made a promise that we would not expand NATO into the former Soviet states or into the Warsaw Pact countries. We didn't abide by that promise, as most of the promises that we do on an international scale we don't abide by. And today, NATO is in Albania, Bulgaria, Croatia, Czech Republic, Estonia, Hungary, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Romania, Slovakia, and Slovenia. And they want to get other countries. Moldavia is going to be another one that's coming in soon. They want to get Ukraine in there. Ukraine is the longest border with Russia. And what NATO is doing is it's surrounding Russia. It's put this missile defense, they call it, but it's really an offensive weapon, these missile defenses, because it's geared for if the US does a first strike against the Soviet Union, they can try to stop any retaliative strikes. So it makes it more probable that there will be a first strike. We now have NATO and US troops all along the border. We do war games just within sight of Russia. And I have to end there. So let me end with this, that the wars we've fought so far, one after the other, after the other, after the other, we claim all these countries are a threat to us. How many countries has Russia invaded? How many countries has North Korea invaded? But how many countries have we invaded? But we invaded Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and small countries with small arms, and we can't even win any of these. We have the longest war ever in Afghanistan. It's still going on. But when you start a war with a country like Russia, it's a nuclear war. And we will not be safe from such a war. It is something we must fight against. We must stop NATO. We must stop the aggression of our own government. And we in the belly of the beast are in the best position to do it. So let's do it.
Thank you, Joe. Our next speaker is Ray McGovern. Ray McGovern is a former Army infantry/intelligence officer and CIA analyst who served under 7 presidents and 9 CIA directors. He was one of the senior analysts who prepared and briefed the President's Daily Brief and also chaired National Intelligence Estimates. He's also the co-founder of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. Ray McGovern.
Thank you. I'm going to time myself here so that I don't get cheated out of a minute or so. Well, we've talked a good bit about Russia, and we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about Ukraine, Hungary, and Palestine especially. I'd like to just trace what's happened in U.S.-Russian or Soviet relations over the last couple of decades, real quick in 8 minutes, drawing out some of the highlights. Okay, the Berlin Wall fell, November 1989. George H.W. Bush, to his credit, called Gorbachev right away, and he said, Mikhail, sorry about your troubles. Rest assured, we're not going to take advantage of them. Whoa. Can you meet with me real quick? Gorbachev says, well, yeah, how quick? How about 3 weeks from now in Malta? Okay. Gorbachev, Shevardnadze, James Baker, our Secretary of State at the time, and George H.W. Bush went to Malta, and they met with Gorbachev, and they said, look, we're serious. As George Bush said it, H.W. Bush again, we're not going to dance on the Berlin Wall. Whoa. We see a Europe free, full, complete, from Lisbon to Vladivostok. Whoa, what an image, huh? What an image. Well, long story short, that image was not to be fulfilled, largely because, well, we ended up precisely taking advantage of Russia. And, Jack Matlock, who was the ambassador at the end of the Soviet Union, the beginning of Russia, said to me, he says, if taking advantage is not what we did, then I don't know what taking advantage means, okay? Joe just mentioned 28 members of NATO. There were 12 when the Berlin Wall fell, and all of them to the east of Germany. So I asked an associate of Gorbachev, his name was Kuvaldin, he's a professor at Moscow University now, and he was one of his advisors back in 1991, and I said, well, why wasn't that agreement written down, where you would withdraw your troops, 300,000 of them, folks, from East Germany, you would accept a reunited Germany. My God, can you imagine how you feel like a Russian when the reunited Germany? And in return, we would not move NATO 1 inch to the east of Germany. That was the promise. So we violated that, and I asked Kuvaldin, why wasn't that written down? And he said, Ray, 2 reasons. One was, we're talking early 1990, right? We're talking at a time when the Warsaw Pact still existed, NATO still existed. We're talking about the Germans, it had to do with Germany, right? So it'd be nice to talk to the Germans about this, before we sign any piece of paper. And Helmut Kohl, who just died yesterday, is on record as having said, we wouldn't move NATO 1 inch to the east of Germany. So that was the main reason, he said, Ray, but there's another reason. And he looked me straight in the eye and he said, we trusted you. Now, this element of trust cannot be more important in international relations. Let's fast forward. At the end of, in the summer of 2013, there was a false flag attack, a sarin attack outside of Damascus, blamed on Bashar al-Assad, but really carried out by the rebels, probably the moderate rebels that Obama later admitted was a fantasy, but moderate rebels did. Okay, so there was a real flag went up, and Obama was persuaded to hold off from waging a major war against Syria. And who bailed them out? Anybody know? Putin. His name was Vladimir Putin, okay? He said, look, Mr. President, this time, I'm sorry for your troubles, but we can help you out. We've been talking to Bashar al-Assad. He's willing to get all his chemical weapons destroyed, and he'll do it on a U.S. ship, if you like. And Obama said, really? And Putin said, yeah, really. Tune into TV tomorrow, and you'll see the foreign minister of Syria saying precisely that. And he did. The deal was struck about the 9th of September 2013. What happens on September 11th, 2013? There's an op-ed in the New York Times. It's written by a fellow named Vladimir Putin. What does he say? He rehearses what the progress of relations between the two countries. And then he says at the end, in a paragraph that I'm reliably informed he wrote himself, he said, I'm very proud and happy about the new atmosphere of trust that exists between the United States and Russia, and personally between me and President Obama. The only thing I disagree with is this concept that America is somehow exceptional, that it's sort of exceptional is enough. He said, and he says, in my view, all countries are equal. They're at various stages of development and various stages of democracy, but they're all equal under God. It sounded like the Declaration of Independence. End of op-ed. Wow. Well, what happened? The neocons didn't get their war. I had a personal experience of seeing Joe Lieberman and Paul Wolfowitz at the top of the CNN building in Washington. I had a little interview with CNN International. I came out, I opened the door, and I knocked over this little guy, almost. And I looked at him, he said, that's Paul Wolfowitz. And he said, hey, well, watch out what you're doing, you know? And I said, oh my God, I'm glad I had that nonviolence training. Besides that, I'm Irish, you know, so I restrained myself. And then, long story short, I watched them do their little interview. Lieberman says, you know, this business about Congress having to declare war, that's for the birds. Obama could do this. He just chickened out. They're all chickened out. They look like their mothers had been run over by a Mack truck. No, you know, some of there's fancy ties. That's 1 minute left, I think. Fancy ties and stuff. Well, these had the black ties, you know. It looked like they were at a funeral. And so I intercepted them on the way out. They were coming through this elevator shaft, looked like something out of Qatar or the Emirates or something, you know, all gold. And I said, Joe, Paul. Now in Washington, you can never admit that you don't recognize somebody who might be important, right? And I had a tie on then, and I had a shirt and everything, my only jacket. And they said, I said, Ray McGovern. Oh, Ray, yeah, it's been a while. Yeah, I said, well, Joe, look, you know, I have this Constitution here that Dennis Kucinich gave me, and I pulled out the Article 1, Section 8. You don't know that only Congress can make war? How long, you've been in Congress, 24 years? And Paul Wolfowitz is slinking away. He says, so I said, look, take this home and read it, and I got a new Constitution, by the way. Then this very tall, beautiful redhead who was supposed to be preventing people like me to get anywhere near, well, she came and she said, oh, gentlemen, I'm so sorry. And I said, well, yeah, I'm sorry too. Why do you let these clowns on your program? They don't even know what it says in the Constitution. So my time's up here now, but let me just finish by saying this. When we were doing this faux attack on ISIS, not even striking at the oil tankers that were going to Turkey, and Putin said to Obama at the UN 2 years ago, he said, look, you know, we're not really happy with the way you're striking against ISIS. We have skin in this game. You have an ocean between you and ISIS. We don't. We have 5,000 people that are coming back to Russia. And so we're going to be serious about this. We would like you to cooperate. Long story short, to his credit, Obama said, all right, I'll have Kerry get together with Lavrov. We'll work it out. 11 months later, they had a deal, a ceasefire, the 12th of September last year. On the 17th of September, the United States Air Force attacked Syrian forces on hilltops that had been there for 6 months. End of ceasefire. Putin, you know, it's really strange. I do this personal arrangement with the President of the United States, and somehow or other, there are people in Washington that don't really obey the Commander-in-Chief. Whom am I going to trust? There's no trust now. Putin knows full well that Trump lashed out at this opportunity there at Lombardo, where there was a chemical explosion, not a chemical weapon, a chemical depot exploded, okay? And what did he do? Well, there were 59 Tomahawk missiles that had an expiration date of April 30, so he fired them off into this airfield there into Syria. Now, I exaggerate about the expiration date, but that's how feckless it was. So what's this do to trust? Well, I'll finish off by saying that Medvedev, who has been president and is likely to be president again of Russia, said that, you know, this destroyed trust. There is no trust between the United States and Russia. And I don't have to tell you how dangerous that is, do I? Do I have to tell anybody how dangerous that is? With all that's been said already here about ABMs and everything else, and Mad Dog Mattis, who brags about being a mad dog as our Secretary of Defense, give me a break. If I were Vladimir Putin, I would try to have the sang-froid, the moderation, the unwillingness to be provoked that he has. But I tell you, for an Irishman, it were really, really hard. Thanks.
Thank you, Ray. Next up, we have Phil Wilayto, who's a co-founder of the Virginia Defenders for Freedom, Justice, and Equality. He's the editor of the Virginia Defender newspaper and an author of several books. He is a coordinator with UNAC's Odessa Solidarity Campaign and a member of UNAC's Administrative Committee and the coordinator for the 2017 UNAC Conference.
That coordinator part has a downside. I have to stick to 8 minutes. What I want to talk about is an international political situation, but also a UNAC initiative, something that we've been involved in for the last 15 months. Back in February of 2014, there was a right-wing coup in Ukraine, and a president, who was not the best president that ever lived, kind of well known for corruption, but he wanted to strengthen economic relationships with Russia, while other forces in the government want to orient to the West, and particularly the European Union. And there were a series of protests that began against his presidency. And they became larger and larger, and then they morphed into a violent coup in which the president was run out of the country and a new president oriented to the West was installed. And that coup will be examined in more detail in the next workshop, one of the next workshops, but this one will take place here in the hall, on the issue of color revolutions, and explain how there was the U.S. State Department and non-governmental organizations, particularly George Soros's Open Society foundations, that played major roles in that coup. And many people died, and the shock troops for the protest movement that morphed into a violent coup were actual fascist organizations modeled after the Ukrainian militias that fought with the Nazis, fought alongside the Nazis in World War II, groups like Wright Sector and Bandera. And after the government was taken over, one of the first things they did was to ban the use of the Russian language in Ukraine. Ukraine is a very multi-ethnic country. There's a large Russian minority, and that Russian minority was forbidden to use its own language. There were forces, Crimea decided that they no longer wanted to be part of a government run by fascist right-wing forces. They voted to rejoin Russia, a country they had been part of for hundreds of years, until 1954. And the fighting broke out in the Donbass region, where there was also a large Russian ethnic minority. The city of Odessa on the Black Sea, which is predominantly Ukrainian, but where the vast majority of the people, over 95%, speak Russian, took a different approach, and they wanted the country to change to a federal system, which simply means that people in local provinces would have the right to elect their own governors. In other words, what we have here in this country. And the reactionary forces that had supported the coup, known as Maidan, named after the square where the fighting took place, attacked the pro-federalist forces in Odessa. And there was a terrible massacre, and 46 people died. Bruce Gagnon described it earlier today, so I won't go into the detail. But it was a horrible massacre in which people were burned to death, died of smoke inhalation, shot, beaten, and many people were arrested up from the Federalist side. The relatives and supporters and friends of those who were massacred formed an organization called the Council of Mothers of May 2, and they demanded an international investigation. And every week they went back to the site of the massacre, the House of Trade Unions in Kulikovo Pole, or Square, in Odessa, and laid flowers and sang songs and made prayers and made speeches, and were regularly attacked by the Wright Sector chapter in Odessa. And there's many videos of this you can see. You look up, you Google Odessa massacre, and you can see the massacre itself. It was videoed by lots of cell phones. But despite the pressure, every week they would have a vigil, and every month it would be a larger vigil. And on the one-year anniversary, it was even a larger vigil. In February, in 2015, representatives of the Council of Mothers came to that year's UNAC conference and spoke about the struggle there and tried to explain to people in this country what had happened. The following spring, in 2016, my wife Anna Edwards and I attended a conference in Wrocław, Poland, in which the Council of Mothers participated. And they asked us to come to Odessa the following May 2nd for the second anniversary of the massacre. And they said they were asking international observers to come from around the world to stand with them because Wright sector was threatening to attack. Another organization had applied for a permit for a rally at the same time in the same place and said they would be teaching machine gun expertise to their young members. And another group called the Brotherhood called for a repeat of May 2nd. So international observers did come to Odessa from several countries around Europe. I found out later that the reason why Bruce Gagnon and Regis Tremblay and myself got through the airport was because one of the members of the Council of Mothers had the names of the international observers on her laptop. The police raided her apartment and seized the laptop, and everybody's name wasn't on it. We didn't make the list. So we got through, and we were there in Kulikovo Square with 3,000 or 4,000 Odessans, men, women, children, young, old, religious, students, all come out to defy the fascists. And it was a successful day, even though the fascists were there in some numbers. It was an incredible experience, and the courage of those people is something I'll never forget. When we came back, in cooperation, in consultation with the Council of Mothers, UNAC started the Odessa Solidarity Campaign. And this was an effort to draw national attention, international attention, on the situation that there was a right-wing government that was supported by the U.S. government and by fascist forces. And on April 10th of this year, in response to requests for assistance from the Council of Mothers, we organized an International Day of Solidarity with the people of Odessa. And Ray McGovern and I delivered a letter to the Ukrainian embassy in Washington, D.C., addressed to President Petro Poroshenko, calling on him to release all political prisoners and end the repression of the people in Odessa. That letter was delivered on the same day, at the same time, in 20 cities in 13 countries across Europe and North America. I think it was the largest display of solidarity for the people of Odessa up to that point. And it was because UNAC is a coalition. And Bruce Gagnon's group, the Global Alliance, and Kevin Zeis's group, Popular Resistance, and David Swanson's group, World Beyond War, all publicized this effort. And the folks in Odessa reached out to their allies and supporters. That's the end of the talk. This is why you should join UNAC. You can multiply your strength. You can join and build a movement strong enough to take on these fascists in the governments overseas and the ones in the White House. Come to the meetings tomorrow when we discuss building UNAC. Join with us, and we'll really be able to do something.
Thank you, Phil. Our final speaker for this wonderful panel will be joining us with a video message. She is Ann Wright. Right there. Ann Wright is a former U.S. Army colonel and diplomat who resigned from the U.S. government in March 2003 in opposition to Bush's war on Iraq. She was a delegate in the 2015 Women's Cross of the DMZ, traveled to Jeju Island in Okinawa on peace missions, participated in 3 flotillas challenging the Israeli blockade of Gaza, and she's the co-author of Dissent, Voices of Conscience. Ann Wright.
Hello, I am Ann Wright. I'm here at my home in Honolulu, Hawaii. Sorry not to be with you all in Richmond, Virginia for the UNAC conference, but I'm home in Hawaii because I am a speaker at the World Youth Congress that's being held here in Honolulu. We'll have hundreds of young people from all over the world that are here to talk about peace, talk about climate, talk about sustainability, of how to keep our planet alive. So with the invitation to come here to speak, I felt it was important to come back to Hawaii, but I do miss being with you all in Richmond. Another thing I'd like to mention is that as I'm speaking to you right now in Richmond, the Hokulea, Polynesian voyaging double hull canoe, is arriving in Honolulu after a 3-year voyage around the world, a voyage that's taken it to 50 countries and hundreds of thousands of people who have learned about the sailing by wind, sea, stars, clouds, and a voyage of peace also, a peace and environment, of keeping our oceans clean, trying to keep the military out of polluting our oceans. And I'll just mention, we do have another incident in the Pacific where a U.S. Navy destroyer has somehow collided with a cargo vessel just going into Tokyo Harbor. How this could happen is pretty unbelievable, where you have a U.S. military vessel that has the most sophisticated navigation in the world on it, and it's kind of like our drones, the drones that keep killing people in Afghanistan and Iraq and Yemen and other places, that the military says it never makes a mistake, it always knows what it's doing, except we know that that is not true. So I am thrilled to be here in Hawaii on this weekend, but I hate missing with you all being in Richmond. I am on the plenary for issues concerning Gaza and Palestine, and I am appreciative of this opportunity to talk about the situation where the Israeli government still continues to pound the people of Palestine, whether they be in the West Bank or in Gaza. And in this graphic, we see over the years from 1947, the partition of the Palestine Mandate, all the way over to 2005, where the partition of the West Bank has now been eaten up. So that over 800,000 Israelis live in the West Bank, which is right here. Gaza, right here, 2 million people live in that tiny little place, 25 miles long, 5 miles wide. 2 million people. When I first started going there in 2009 with Code Pink Women for Peace, right after the 2009 Israeli attack, there were 1.6 million. Now there are 2 million people that live in there. The Israelis have a naval blockade and a land blockade on Gaza. You know, going back to the West Bank, I think our other plenary person will talk about the situation there of the illegal settlements, the huge numbers of prisoners, and talk about the prisoner strike that has just recently been held by over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners, many of them, most of them, without any charges against them, being held in administrative detention. I want to talk more about Gaza because that's where I'm most familiar in terms of having gone there many times in 2009, 10, 11, but with the Israeli attack in 2014, the borders have essentially been closed. But we could still continue to try to bring international attention to what's going on in Gaza, and that's through one group that I work with called the Gaza Freedom Flotilla, and this particular women's boat to Gaza that you probably heard about last autumn, where we took 2 sailboats to break the Israeli naval blockade of Gaza, to bring international attention to the horrific conditions in Gaza, conditions that they say by the year 2020 will make Gaza uninhabitable. The lack of water, the lack of electricity, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But we are sailing these boats to show that the international community has not forgotten Gaza, to give hope to the people of Gaza. Here are 2 boats that we had last year, the Zaytuna and the Amal, Only one of them made the complete journey of 1,700 miles from Barcelona, Spain, to Ajaccio, Corsica, France, down to Messina, Sicily, and then the last part, 1,000 miles to 34 miles off the coast of Gaza when the Israeli military attacked us. I wanted to mention this photograph. Right here is the little place called Gaza. It is the place in darkness, right there, between all of the lights of Israel and then El Arish and Egypt. But right in there is Gaza. As we approached, having been taken against our will, kidnapped against our will by the Israeli military, we could see straight ahead of us the perpetual darkness that is Gaza. And now the Israeli government has cut off even more electricity, where even less than the 4 hours a day will now be, the people of Gaza will have less than 4 hours of electricity, which will impact greatly upon the healthcare situation, upon schools, upon everything in Gaza. So we have a campaign that's starting up on that, and we would be glad to work with you on that. Now, I want to mention one other campaign that we have, and that's on the Gaza fishermen. And I'll show you just this little clip. Gaza fishermen have to stay within 2 to 4 miles of the shore, or the Israelis will come and do exactly what they're doing right here to these folks. So we are showing videos like this to fishing communities all over the world to say, please think about these people and put pressure on the Israeli government to stop what is happening to the fishers of Gaza. That's one of the campaigns of the Gaza Freedom Flotilla this summer. And as we start another campaign, though, for the 2018 flotilla, where we will keep going until the people of Gaza and Palestine are free. And with that, I want to say aloha, peace in the world, and keep kicking butt all over the world. Don't let these jerks get us. And adios and aloha from Honolulu.
All right, so that ends this round of panels. Please give it up for our panelists.